Welcome back. All right, so I wanted to talk about things now that we're about a month away we're a month away from the end of the regular season. I think April 18th is the last day of the regular season. So since it's March 18th, let's take a look at which teams are playing well. And there's a reason why I wanted to talk about this today. Very often we get stuck on who's at the top of the standings and who's, all right, so this team's the best, this team's best. And then at playoff time, the team that's number one in the standings gets knocked out, and everybody's like, see, President's Trophy curse. The reality is that a lot of teams may end up having cumulatively the best record at the end of an 82 game schedule. It doesn't necessarily mean that's the team that's playing the best going into the playoffs. And I think that's where things get a little bit murky here and there. It's something that when we do, when I do the playoff previews in a month's time, I want to take into account on who's playing the best hockey going into the playoffs. Now, according to the stats from the National Hockey League website itself, since January 1st, the team that's playing best in the 2024 calendar year is the Edmonton Oilers, in that they've got the best points percentage. A 758 points percentage. They're 22-6-3 since January 1st. Over the last month, they're 8-3-3. So a bit more issues with them over the last month than over that 16-game winning streak they had there. But the reality is this is the team is playing well. Now, in the overall standings, they're 10th. And certainly there's a lot of discussion of, well, if they were that good, they wouldn't be where they are in the standings. I saw a lot of that when they were in a wild card spot. The reality being they had a really, really bad start to the season. So the fact they were in a playoff spot at all was nothing short of miraculous. Now, they're scoring 3.48 goals per game. They're allowing 2.39 goals against per game. Part of the reason I wanted to do this video is there's a narrative out there the goaltending and the defense isn't good enough for Edmonton. I don't know what's going to happen in the playoffs, certainly, but it's been good enough so far. And Skinner's playing really, really well. Now, if they're leading after the first period, they're 8-1-1. If they're leading after the second period, they're 10-0-1. So they're very good at protecting leads. If they're trailing, they're good at coming back too. If they're trailing after the first, they're 5-3. And again, this is over that time period since January 1st. 3-4-2 if they're trailing after two. So the Oilers have only lost 4 in regulation over the 9 games they've trailed after 2. That's fantastic. So the Oilers have been playing really, really well. Florida's right there with them. 750 points percentage for Florida as they're 23-7-2. Since January 1st, they're 9-4 over the last month. Scoring 3.59 goals per game and allowing 2.25 goals against per game. Bobrovsky's playing really, really well. So Stolarz. So with that 750 points percentage, they're also third in the NHL overall and could very well end up getting that President's Trophy, which, as I mentioned before, means, well, you're done, right? But after the first period, if they're leading, they're 9-1-1. They're 15-0-2 if they're leading after 2. So don't let them have a lead after 2 if you're playing against Florida. Easier said than done. If they're trailing after the first, they're 4-4. If they're trailing after the second, they're 2-4. I'm actually kind of surprised it's not better because Florida kind of been known as a comeback team over the last few years. And then you get to Carolina. They have a 742 points percentage. They're 22-7-2 since January 1st, scoring 3.45 goals per game and allowing 2.1. And over the last month, they're 10-3-1. Carolina's playing really, really well. Ask any Carolina fan and they will tell you. 9-1-1 when they're leading after the first, or 11-0-1. Sorry, I looked at the Florida number. 11-0-1 if they're leading after the first, 13-1 if they're leading after the second period. So don't fall behind against Carolina. If they're trailing after the first, they're 4-4. If they're trailing after the second, they're 2-3. So they've been able to have comeback victories, and if they have a lead, they're pretty solid with the lead. So I think we can agree these three are playing at an elite level since January the 1st, right? The problem is people won't necessarily agree. There's a negative bias against, well, Edmonton's a Canadian team. And it does feel like that's the narrative. Like when I'm watching the American broadcast and talking about who the contenders are, and I keep thinking, you guys going to mention a Canadian team in there? And then it'll kind of be kind of a throwaway mention. And it's like, so, and I get it. Like a Canadian team hasn't won the Cup since 1993. But just for me looking at it, I think, why can't they? Now, there may be reasons why they won't, but right now, there's no reason to think they can't, and the Oilers' numbers are excellent. So are Toronto's. They're 21-9-2 since the 1st of January, 688 points percentage for 4th overall. They are 9th overall in the standings, right behind Carolina, who are 8th overall in the standings. A 3.63 goals scored per game number is excellent. I think it might be one of the highest on the board. It is right behind Tampa and Colorado. So their scoring rate is one of the highest on the board. The goals against, 2.78. That's a bit of an issue, sure, but they're 9-3-1 over the last month. So they're playing really well. They're 9-2 if they have a lead after the first period. They're 15-3-1 if they're leading after the second. So, I mean, they have 3 regulation losses if they're leading after the second. That is higher than the other teams. They also have 15 wins, which is tied with Florida for second highest after the Rangers. So that's something that obviously Toronto has to work on. But in terms of comebacks, well, if they're trailing after the first, they're 6-4. So Toronto's really good at coming from behind when they are behind after the first. However, if they're trailing after the second, you might be able to turn off the TV. They're 1-6. But again, the narrative that, oh, Toronto's terrible, I see it here and there, and it's like, no. And then like they lose a multi-goal lead for the first time all season, and suddenly it's, oh, what's happening? Is this what's going to happen? Maybe this year Toronto does well. And I'm not saying they win the cup. I'm just saying maybe this year Toronto does well in the playoffs. And as much as people want to laugh at it, there are a lot of playoff runs that nobody saw coming that did. And I'm going to have to do a video on that at some point soon. Maybe today. Who knows? It's a nice day out, so maybe I'll stay in and do that. Colorado, 677 points percentage, 29-2. So they've played one less game than Toronto since January the 1st and have one less win. But scoring 3.84 goals per game, that's really good. 3.00 goals against per game. I do have concerns with Colorado when it comes to the goaltending. I don't know if Georgiev can get them to the cup. I hope he can. I like Georgiev a lot. They're 10-2-1 over the last month. They've played really, really well. And they're 6th overall in the standings, 8-1-1 if they have a lead after the first period, 12-0-2 if they have a lead after the second. If they're trailing after the first, you can't close the book on Colorado. They're 6-5. And if they're trailing after the second, same thing, they're 5-7. So comeback victories, Colorado's made it clear that's not a big deal. They don't view any deficit as being a problem. I do see Colorado as being a problem for anybody playing against them in the playoffs. Winnipeg. Winnipeg's 21-10-1 since the start of the calendar year, 672 points percentage, scoring 2.91 goals per game, which is one of the lower numbers on the board. It's not the lowest, but it's lower. 2.19 goals against, though, that's pretty excellent, right there with Carolina in that. And they're 10-5 over the last month. Now, if they're leading after the first period, they're 11-1, pretty close to automatic. They are automatic if they're leading after the second, 14-0. Now, if they're losing the game, they lose the game. They're 2-8 if they're trailing after the first. They're 3-8 if they're trailing after the second. So they're mildly better trailing after the second than trailing after the first. That is odd. But for Winnipeg, that first goal, that getting ahead, that's really, really important. Vancouver, 19-8-5, 672 points percentage, so same points percentage as Winnipeg since the first of the year. 3.19 goals scored per game. The 2.81 goals against per game is problematic, as is the fact they're 5-2 over the last month. It definitely feels like Vancouver peaked really early, and now, yes, they're very, very much a playoff team, but where are they going to end up finishing when it comes to the playoffs? Now, they should finish first in their division. However, you can see here Edmonton's catching up and making up ground on them. But B, once we get to the playoffs, regardless of where they finish, are they going to be able to get back to who they were earlier in the season? That's my concern. They're 4th overall in the standings, Winnipeg 5th, Colorado 6th, as mentioned before. If they're leading after the first, they're not as automatic as other teams. Vancouver 10-4-3. If they're leading after the second, not quite as automatic as other teams either, 14-1-4. So that's an issue they didn't have earlier in the season either. I did make mention of that in videos that it was nice to watch Canuck games and not have to worry about if they're going to blow the lead. If they had a lead, they were pretty automatic. That's changed. If they're trailing after the first, they're 1-2-2, which means they very rarely trail after the first. If they're trailing after the second, they're 2-4-1. So they've shown some capability of coming back, but they've also shown a capability of losing leads. So a little more unpredictability in there and a mediocre record. Hopefully they can get that turned around in time for the playoffs in a month. Boston, 18-7-9 since the first of the year, scoring 3.41 goals per game, allowing 2.82 goals against per game. The much talked about goaltending tandem of Swayman and Ullmark. I think Ullmark's been the better goalie in recent weeks. They're 8-2-4 over the last month. So they've only lost 2 in regulation, but they've won 8 out of 14. Right around, kind of a mediocre number, but they're first overall. And that is something that will get pointed out. Well, they're first overall. Right. And the team that's first overall does what in the playoffs? Right. So, in terms of leading after the first and second, they're pretty good. They've blown some leads, but they've managed to get points out of it. So they're 10-0-3 if they lead after the first, 14-0-3 if they lead after the second. If they're trailing, forget it. They're 0-5-2 if they trail after the first. They're 0-7-2 if they trail after the second. Part of the reason I put this together is because I don't hear much about Boston's struggles, but I hear a lot about Toronto's, and I hear a lot about Edmonton's anytime they lose a single game. It's weird. So we go over to the second side of the board here, second column, second half of the board, and we've got Nashville, 19-9-3, but 11-0-2 over the last month. They're playing fantastic, peaking at the right time. They're 11th in the overall standings, 661 points percentage since the start of the calendar year, scoring 3.34 goals per game and allowing 2.84 goals against per game. One of the things that's turned things around for Nashville is UC Saros' play. He's been fantastic. They're 10-1-2 if they lead after the first. They're 13-1 if they lead after the second. If they trail, you can turn the game off. If they're trailing after the first, it's 0-7 if they're trailing after the first. If they trail after the second, they're 1-7. They've got a comeback victory in there. So, yeah, Nashville, really, really important to have that lead after the first period or second period. Then you got the New York Rangers. The Rangers 20-10-3 since the start of the calendar year, 652 points percentage, scoring 3.27 goals per game and allowing 2.67 goals against per game. And recently we've seen Jonathan Quick's numbers going a little bit in the wrong direction, but I think the reality is Shesterkin's numbers have just got a lot better. So Shesterkin's just playing like we know Igor can. The Rangers are 10-3-1 over the last month. They are second in the overall standings in the National Hockey League. If they lead after the first, they're 9-2-2, which isn't as strong as some of the other numbers. But if they lead after the second, forget about it. They're 17-1-1. If they trail after the first, they're 6-5-1. So they're able to come back. If they trail after the second, they're 3-7-1. So that comeback, it's there. They're able to do that. The New York Rangers, definitely a team that you don't want to let up on if you've got a lead. Tampa Bay, the Bolts they're going to be fascinating come playoff time. I have no idea what to expect. Their 638 points percentage, 18-10-1 record since January 1st is impressive. They're scoring 3.72 goals per game. They're allowing 3.24 goals against per game. So as we get closer to the playoffs, they're going to need to bring those goals against down. I think it's a combination of Vasilevsky having some games that aren't quite Vasilevsky-like games, and just the blue line in front of them not being as stellar as it was, say, 3-4 years ago. But they're 6-4-1 over the last month, and if you make it, you make it. And again, I haven't heard anything panicked about Tampa Bay, really. Just, Tampa Bay's down near the playoff line, but they're going to make it, no problem. So if they lead after the first, they're 10-1. If they lead after the second, they're 13-0-1. So that's important because if they're trailing after the first, they're 2-6. If they're trailing after the second, they're 1-9. They're 14th in the overall standings right now. But again, Tampa Bay, I think if they went on a bit of a run, I don't think anybody'd be surprised. You still got the star power there, and they still have the ability to put together pretty impressive results. And Vasi showed against Florida, he can still put up 47 saves on 50 shots. So, yeah. I'm not saying he has to save that amount every night because Tampa Bay shouldn't be allowing 50 shots a night, but he can still make a lot of saves. Dallas is 19-10-5 since the turn of the calendar year. Their 632 points percentage puts them at 12th on the board. They're scoring 3.59 goals per game. They're allowing an even 3. And I've talked about it. I've talked about Oettinger, a bit uneven. The teams have been uneven. They're 7-5-2 over the last month. They're 12-2 though if they have a lead after the first period. They're 14-1-2 if they have a lead after the second. So really for Dallas, it is getting that early start and getting off to a really good strong run. Because if they're trailing, actually the numbers aren't bad when they're trailing either. They're 3-5-2 if they trail after the first. They're 3-8 if they trail after the second. So, honestly, this is a team that sits 7th in the overall standings. I have no idea what to expect from them come playoff time. None. I would love to stand here and say, oh, no, they'll turn it around, or they'll be out. I'd love to give a definitive answer. I have no idea. They could be out in 4 games in the first round. They could win the Stanley Cup. It really, there's so many reasons to both root for and say this team could win. And then there's the other concerns as well. We go, maybe, but everything has to fall their way. And then St. Louis might be a bit of a surprise to people, but yeah, they're 18-12-2 since January 1st, 594 points percentage, and they're now 16th overall in the standings. Yep, they're right there. 2.69 goals scored per game, allowing 2.72 goals against per game. This also means we could have a team in the East make the playoffs that wouldn't have made it in the West. How surprising would that be? But yeah, they're 7-6-1 over the last month, St. Louis. But good game yesterday. Yeah, we'll see how things go for them over the next month. 16th, as I said, in the overall standings. 8-0-1 if they lead after the first. 11-0 if they lead after the second. Pretty automatic there. 5-5 if they trail after the first. 2-9 if they trail after the second. So just don't trail after the second. Pretty easy. It's just like New Jersey. You can't score first. We'll just go score first then. But anyways, they're not allowed. They even tried last night. It was just they take that goal away. New Jersey's not allowed to score first. They're also not on the board, so we would have expected that at the start of the year. Not this guy. All right, Buffalo, 17-12-1 since January 1st, 583 points percentage, but they sit 23rd in the overall standings in the NHL, scoring 2.93 goals per game and allowing 2.33 goals against per game. The era of UPL is upon us. This is a Buffalo team that, again, they're 8-5-1 over the last month. They're giving hope to their fans, and I can't buy it. I can't. I hope I'm wrong. I hope next year they make the playoffs, but it doesn't look like they do this year. If they're leading after the first, since January 1st, they're 5-1, meaning they don't lead after the first very often. That's in 30 games. They've led after the first 6 times. They lead after the second, they're 11-1. If they're trailing after the first, they're 4-8. If they're trailing after the second, they're 2-11. So not awful, considering where they are in the overall board. Not awful. Then we get to Calgary. They're 18-13 since the start of the calendar year. 581 points percentage, scoring 3.35 goals per game, allowing 3.06 goals against per game. They're much vaunted defense. This is a defense that everybody was praising a few years ago. It's really taken a hit over the last couple of years. They're 8-4 over the last month though, and I don't see any reason why Calgary can't turn it around and become a playoff team again next season. That being said, they're 21st in the overall standings currently. They're 9-4 if they lead after the first. If they lead after the second, they're 13-1. Good numbers there. If they're trailing after the first, they're 3-4. If they're trailing after the second, they're 4-10. That's 14 times they've been trailing after the second period. I think that's the highest number of any team on the board until you get to Detroit. Yes. And here's 13 times they've been trailing after the second for Buffalo. So it is interesting to note that some of the teams in this area of the board end up trailing after the second period more often. Shouldn't be a surprise, but I thought I'd mention it. Detroit, 17-12-2 since the start of the calendar year, 581 points percentage. They're 6-8 though over the last month. I mean, there's part of me who wants to say they don't look interested to be in the playoffs, but that's not true. Something's changed, something's gone wrong. They've lost 8 of their last 9. I have no idea what's happened. They're scoring 3.19 goals per game. They're allowing 3.26 goals against per game. So they're the only team out of the 16 with a negative goal differential. 6-1-1 if they lead after the first. 10-0 if they lead after the second. Really, for Detroit, get that lead and you can hold it. But if they're trailing after the first, they're 2-7. If they trail after the second, they're 5-10-1. So they've been trailing after the second period 16 times in 31 games. That's not a recipe for success. What's interesting, too, about this board is the LA Kings are 12th in the standings. Vegas is 13th. Philadelphia is 15th. They do not have top 16 numbers in the overall grand picture of things. Vegas, in fact, has a 500 record since the 1st of January. They've been just wildly mediocre. And yet, the only thing we hear about Vegas is how, well, they're cheating the cap and yada, yada, yada. But they haven't been very good either. So I wanted to make a video on this because one of these 16 teams is very likely to be the Stanley Cup champions, keeping in mind that there are 3 playoff teams not on the board in LA, Vegas, and Philadelphia. And the Caps, surprisingly, didn't qualify for this board. They were close. The Caps numbers have been relatively strong. But, yeah, there's your top 16 since the 1st of January. And again, we've got at least 2 teams here. I don't think Calgary or Buffalo make it. But Detroit, maybe they do, maybe they don't. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. How important do you think it is for a team to be playing well as we get ready for the playoffs? Or do you think, you know what, if a team's near the top of the league, who cares if they have some bad games and a few bad weeks? They'll be fine. because I know there's that narrative as well, but it really seems to depend on which team we're covering. So there are some that it feels like no matter how they're playing, the media and the fans will just say, well, they're really good. I've noticed that with Colorado. I've noticed that with Florida. I've noticed that with the Rangers. That no matter how they're playing, and Boston too, no matter how they're playing, once you get into a broadcast, especially if it's like a nationwide broadcast, whether it's Canada or the States, they'll say, oh, they're playing really, really well. And there's been times where I've kind of been scratching my head and thinking, but they haven't recently. But I understand people are looking at the overall record, and I think there's a reputation. Certain teams have a reputation as winners, and I think that makes a difference. I think that's why Tampa Bay, there hasn't been any doom and gloom around Tampa Bay, because they're seen as a winning team. And I think that's part of the reason why the Oilers and the Leafs make easy targets. And so does Winnipeg, and so does Vancouver, because being Canadian teams, no Canadian teams won since 1993, it is easy to get that idea pushed out there that these teams aren't going to be good enough. They're falling apart at the wrong time. Even though you can rightfully make that argument with Vancouver, I don't think you can with Winnipeg, Toronto, or Edmonton as they're playing right now. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. I don't know if that qualifies as a madness board. I don't know if there's enough numbers, but you guys can let me know your thoughts. Thanks again for all your support. I'll talk to you again soon.